So many of you may recall that back in April, I talked about this controversy surrounding Doom Eternal and the mix for the official soundtrack that was released after the game's launch. The way it was detailed by the following Twitter user, the ACDC guy, is here's a comparison between the original BFG division from Doom 2016's official soundtrack left versus the BFG 2020 remix on Eternal soundtrack from today right. Notice how the wavelengths in 2020 form a nearly perfect straight bar versus the original with more definition. So this right here has more definition, whereas this right here, everything's sort of flat towards the top and bottom, which suggests that the audio was compressed and there's not a lot of harmony with the instruments. Everything's kind of loud and competing with each other rather than all of the instruments harmonizing and the entire soundtrack providing dynamicism that is important to a good listening experience. As all of that was detailed, the guy behind the Doom soundtrack, the composer for Doom, Mick Gordon, responded with, "I didn't mix those and wouldn't have done that. You'll be able to spot the small handful of tracks I mixed." He was upset enough that when somebody reached out to him with, "Yo, Mick, are you going to be there if id decides to work on another Doom game?" He responded with, "Doubt we'll work together again." And then to PC Gamer, here's what he had to say, "I take a lot of pride in my work. It's all I do. It's all I have. And I pour my heart and soul into it." Once word began to spread, the Doom community was pretty upset about this, and there was tangible backlash against Bethesda and id, with Reddit posts like this with over 19,000 upvotes that reads, "Bethesda, you can still do the right thing here, let the guy finish his work." And here is an image of the original soundtrack cover with the words, "Let Mick finish his work," layered on top. As the situation continued to develop, we hadn't really heard from Bethesda or id until now, May 4th, 2020, when Marty Stratton, executive producer for Doom Eternal, posted an open letter in which he explained the situation, and this situation is more complicated than people think. So here's the entire letter. I want to make sure I convey everything that they have to say on this issue. So here's what that letter reads like. An open letter to the incredible Doom community. Over the past few weeks, I've seen lots of discussion centered around the release of the Doom Eternal original game soundtrack. While many fans like the OST, there is speculation and criticism around the fact that the game's talented and popular composer Mick Gordon edited and mixed only 12 of the 59 tracks on the OST, the remainder being edited by our lead audio designer here at id. Some have suggested that we have been careless with or disrespectful of the game music. Others have speculated that Mick wasn't given the time or creative freedom to deliver something different or better. The fact is, none of that is true. What has become unacceptable to me are the direct and personal attacks on our lead audio designer, particularly considering his outstanding contributions to the game, as well as the damage this mischaracterization is doing to the many talented people who have contributed to the game and continue to support it. I feel it is my responsibility to respond on their behalf. We have enjoyed an amazingly open and honest relationship with our fans, so given our passion on this topic and the depth of misunderstanding, I'm compelled to present the entire story. When asked on social media about his future with Doom, Mick has replied, "Doubt we'll work together again." This was surprising to see, as we have never discussed ending our collaboration with him until now, but his statement does highlight a complicated relationship. Our challenges have never been a matter of creative differences. Mick has had near limitless creative autonomy over music composition and mixing in our recent Doom games, and I think the results have been tremendous. His music is defining, and much like Bobby Prince's music was synonymous with the original Doom games from the 90s, Mick's unique style and sound have become synonymous with our latest projects. He's deserved every award won, and I hope his incredible score for Doom Eternal is met with similar accolades. He will deserve them all. Talent aside, we have struggled to connect on some of the more production-related realities of development, while communications around those issues have eroded trust. For id, this has created an unsuitable pattern of project uncertainty and risk. At E3 last year, we announced that the original soundtrack would be included with the Doom Eternal Collector's Edition version of the game. At that point in time, we didn't have Mick under contract for the OST, and because of ongoing issues receiving the music we needed for the game, did not want to add the distraction at the time. After discussions with Mick in January of this year, we reached general agreement on the terms for Mick to deliver the OST by early March, in time to meet the consumer commitment of including the digital OST with the Doom Eternal Collector's Edition at launch. The terms of the OST agreement with Mick were similar to the agreement on Doom 2016 in that it required him to deliver a minimum of 12 tracks but added bonus payments for on-time delivery. The agreement also gives him complete creative control over what he delivers. On February 24th, Mick reached out to communicate that he and his team were fine with the terms of the agreement, but that there was a lot more work involved than anticipated, a lot of content to wade through, and that while he was making progress, it was taking longer than expected. He apologized and asked that ideally he be given an additional 4 weeks to get everything together. He offered that the extra time would allow him to provide upwards of 30 tracks and a runtime over 2 hours, including all music from the game arranged in soundtrack format, and as he felt it would best represent the score in the best possible way. Mick's request was accommodated, allowing for an even longer extension of almost 6 weeks with a new final delivery date of mid-April. Now, I want to note for a second here that you can actually see the tweet from March 11th, 2020 when Bethesda announced, quote, "The official game soundtrack for Doom Eternal is not yet complete, so it won't be available on the game's launch of 3/2020. We'll let everyone, including those who purchased the Collector's Edition, know when it is ready. For more details, please read our full statement. To be clear, Doom Eternal is not delayed and will be arriving with a complete in-game soundtrack. This is strictly referring to the standalone official game soundtrack that will be available separately from the game. The music in the game is complete and not affected by this delay. The Collector's Edition comes with a cassette tape, which includes download codes for the full, lossless digital copies of the Doom 2016 soundtrack and Doom Eternal soundtrack. The Doom Eternal original game soundtrack will be available at a later date." So there were signs of delay and scheduling conflicts here. The open letter continues. "In that communication, we noted our understanding of him needing the extra time to ensure the OST meets his quality bar and even move the bonus payment for on-time delivery to align with the new date so he could still receive the full compensation intended, which he will. In early March, we announced via Twitter that the OST component in the Doom Eternal Collector's Edition was delayed and would not be available as originally intended," which harkens to the tweet that I just pointed out. It's important to note at this point that not only were we disappointed to not deliver the OST with the launch of the Collector's Edition, we needed to be mindful of consumer protection laws in many countries that allow customers to demand a full refund for a product if a product is not delivered on or about its announced availability date. Even with that, the mid-April delivery would allow us to meet our commitments to customers while also allowing Mick the time he had ideally requested. As we hit April, we grew increasingly concerned about Mick delivering the OSTs to us on time. I personally asked our lead audio designer at id, Chad, to begin work on id versions of the tracks, a backup plan should Mick not be able to deliver on time. To complete this, Chad would need to take all of the music as Mick had delivered for the game, edit the pieces together into tracks, and arrange those tracks into a comprehensive OST. It is important to understand that there is a difference between music mixed for inclusion in the game and music mixed for inclusion in the OST. Several people have noted this difference when looking at the waveforms, but have misunderstood why there's a difference. When a track looks bricked or like a bar, where the extreme highs and lows of the dynamic range are clipped, this is how we receive the music from Mick for inclusion in the game, in fragments pre-mixed and pre-compressed by him. Those music fragments he delivers then go into our audio system and are combined in real time as you play through the game. Alternatively, when mixing and mastering for an OST, Mick starts with his source material, which we don't typically have access to, and remixes for the OST to ensure the highs and lows are not clipped as seen in his 12 OST tracks. This is all important to note because Chad only had these pre-mixed and pre-compressed game fragments from Mick to work with in editing the id versions of the tracks. He simply edited the same music you hear in the game to create a comprehensive OST, though some of the edits did require slight volume adjustments to prevent further clipping. In other words, while Mick claimed right here that I didn't mix those and wouldn't have done that, it turns out that this version of the track right here, which has all of the sort of flattened peaks versus the more dynamic track here, this right here is actually a version of the track that Mick handed over to id. It's just that this is more for in-game use, whereas this right here was what was intended for the original soundtrack official release. And all the audio engineer at id did was take what Mick had already given him for the game version of the soundtrack and just arranged everything so that it could be released in official soundtrack format. So there's a misunderstanding there that id clarifies here. The open letter keeps going. In early April, I sent an email to Mick reiterating the importance of hitting his extended contractual due date and outlined in detail the reasons we needed to meet our commitments to our customers. I let him know that Chad had started work on the backup tracks, but reiterated that our expectation and preference was to release what he delivered. Several days later, Mick suggested that he and Chad working on the backup combine what each had been working on to come up with a more comprehensive release. The next day, Chad informed Mick that he was rebuilding tracks based on the chunks, fragments mixed and delivered for the game. Mick replied that he personally was contracted for 12 tracks and suggested again that we use some of Chad's arrangements to fill out the soundtrack beyond the 12 songs. Mick asked Chad to send over what he'd done so that he could package everything up and balance it all for delivery. As requested, Chad sent Mick everything he had done. On the day the music was due from Mick, I asked what we could expect from him. Mick indicated that he was still finishing a number of things, but that it would be no less than 12 tracks and about 60 minutes of music, and that it would come in late evening. The next morning, Mick informed us that he'd run into some issues with several tracks and that it would take additional time to finish, indicating he understood we were in a tight position for launching and asked how we'd like to proceed. We asked him to deliver the tracks he'd completed and then followed up with the remaining tracks as soon as possible. After listening to the 9 tracks he delivered, I wrote him that I didn't think those tracks would meet the expectations of Doom or Mick fans. There was only one track with the type of heavy combat music people would expect, and most of the others were ambient in nature. I asked for a call to discuss. Instead, he replied that the additional tracks he was trying to deliver were in fact the combat tracks and that they are the most difficult to get right. He again suggested that if more heavy tracks are needed, Chad's tracks could be used to flesh it out further. After considering his recommendations, I let Mick know that we would move forward with the combined effort to provide a more comprehensive collection of the music from the game. I let Mick know that Chad had ordered his edited tracks as a chronology of the game music, and that to create the combined work, Chad would insert Mick's delivered tracks into the OST chronology where appropriate, and then delete his own tracks containing similar thematic material. I said that if his additional combat tracks come in soon, we do the same to include them in the OST or offer them later as bonus tracks. Mick delivered 2 final tracks, which we incorporated, and he wished us luck wrapping it up. I thanked him and let him know that we'd be happy to deliver his final track as a bonus later on, and reminded him our plans for distribution of the OST, first to collector edition owners, then later on other distribution platforms. So based on this open letter, it sounds to me as though Mick Gordon did get a lot of creative freedom and was given as much accommodation as id could muster based on the deadlines that they had to deal with, but Mick just couldn't deliver the work on time, and so Mick approved this idea of combining the work that Chad had done with Mick's own mixes, and that's how we got the final product that a lot of people noticed something's weird about many of the tracks in the official soundtrack release. The open letter proceeds with, on April 19th, we released the OST to collector edition owners. As mentioned earlier, soon after release, some of our fans noted and posted online the waveform difference between the tracks Mick had mixed from his source files and the tracks that Chad had edited from Mick's final game music with Mick's knowledge and at his suggestion. In reply to one fan, Mick said he didn't mix those and wouldn't have done that. That and a couple of other simple messages distancing from the realities and truths I've outlined has generated unnecessary speculation and judgment, and led some to vilify and attack an id employee who had simply stepped up to the request of delivering a more comprehensive OST. Mick has shared with me that the attacks on Chad are distressing, but he's done nothing to change the conversation. So he's relayed privately, man, this situation sucks, but publicly he hasn't really clarified the situation one bit, just putting forth this narrative that he was in no way, shape, or form involved in how the original soundtrack was released, despite a major factor for the inconsistent quality being his inability to deliver and his approval of combining Chad's efforts with his own. Marty Strand then continues in his letter that after reaching out to Mick several times via email to understand what prompted his online posts, we were able to talk. He shared several issues that I'd also like to address. First, he said that he was surprised by the scope of what was released, the 59 tracks. Chad had sent sent Mick everything more than a week before the final deadline, and I described to him our plan to combine the id edited tracks with his own tracks, as he'd suggested doing. The tracks Mick delivered covered only a portion of the music in the game, so the only way to deliver a comprehensive OST was to combine the tracks Mick delivered with the tracks id had edited from the game music. If Mick is dissatisfied with the content of his delivery, we would certainly entertain distributing additional tracks. I also know that Mick feels that some of the work included in the id edited tracks was originally intended more as demos or mock-ups when originally sent. However, Chad only used music that was in-game or was part of a cinematic music construction kit. Mick also communicated that he wasn't particularly happy with some of the edits in the id tracks. I understand this from an artist's perspective and realize this opinion is what prompted him to distance from the work in the first place. That said, from our perspective, we didn't want to be involved in the content of the OST and did absolutely nothing to prevent him from delivering on his commitments within the time frame he asked for, and we extended multiple times. Finally, Mick was concerned that we'd given Chad co-composer credit, which we did not do and would never have done. In the metadata, Mick is listed as the sole composer and sole album artist. On tracks edited by id, Chad is listed as a contributing artist. That was the best option to clearly delineate for fans which tracks Mick delivered and which tracks id's lead audio designer had edited. It would have been misleading for us to attribute tracks solely to Mick that someone else had edited. The open letter finally concludes with, "If you've read all of this, thank you for your time and attention. As for the immediate future, we are at the point of moving on and won't be working with Mick on the DLC we currently have in production." In other words, they're officially breaking up. And while we don't know if in the future they'll work things out and work together again for the DLC, they're moving on without Mick. As I've mentioned, his music is incredible. He's a rare talent, and I hope he wins many awards for his contribution to Doom Eternal at the end of the year. I'm as disappointed as anyone that we're at this point, but as we have many times before, we will adapt to changing circumstances and pursue the most unique and talented artists in the industry with whom to collaborate. Our team has enjoyed this creative collaboration a great deal, and we know Mick will continue to delight fans for many years ahead. With respect and appreciation, Marty Stratton, executive producer, Doom Eternal. So yeah, a lot to unpack here, but the main thing is this: Mick Gordon was given all the creative freedom and even more time than was originally contractually agreed upon to do what he needs to do to release the best version of his soundtrack, and he couldn't deliver on time, and so Bethesda and id had to move forward with an alternative solution that involved combining Chad's edits and Mick's mixes. And that led to all of this. And assuming what the open letter saying is true, then it would seem as though Mick Gordon has mischaracterized the situation and sort of put all the blame on Bethesda and id, rather than discussing some of the blame that he has for not delivering his music on time, his mixes and edits on time. And on some level, I understand that Mick Gordon is a perfectionist and really wants the highest quality for his soundtrack, but when you contractually agree upon a deadline and say that you'll be able to deliver by a certain date, and people are relying on you to deliver, it is up to you to deliver. And in the end, Mick Gordon did agree, okay, I can't deliver on everything, so here are some tracks that I already mixed, combine it with, some of the stuff that Chad worked on. And so Mick actually agreed upon this release. And yet he came out and said that, I had nothing to do with what went on here. Those are not my tracks, and distanced himself, even though he's actually more connected to how the official soundtrack released and he's letting on. So this situation is more complicated than Bethesda and id not giving Mick the time and creative freedom to do what he wants. It's a lot more complicated than that. They actually did try to accommodate him in every way possible. They even offered to extend the contract so he could get paid in full with all the bonuses involved. But even with that extension, Mick couldn't deliver, and Bethesda and id had an obligation to the customers with the deadlines and the release dates that they had set. At the end of the day, not one party had ill intent. Everyone wanted what's best for the soundtrack and for the game, but production issues ultimately led to this, and there was a mischaracterization of the situation by Mick himself, and I think it is good for the executive producer here, Marty Stratton, to be transparent and open and release this open letter that at the very least explains his side of things from his perspective and where he's coming from with all of this. I think id and Bethesda could have informed people about the fact that, there will be some inconsistencies with the official soundtrack release. They could have announced that, and this issue could have been mitigated. If all of this was more well known before the soundtrack's release, it would have been nice for customers to get a heads up about the inconsistencies in the soundtrack mixes. But that aside, id was as flexible as they could possibly be with Mick and gave him as much time as they could and let him do whatever he wanted. Now, at the end of the day, there is no denying that the official soundtrack release isn't in the best quality possible. It isn't the ideal version of the official soundtrack, but id did their best to work with what they had. And there are a lot of details here that certainly warrant some merit, a lot of consideration. At the end of the day, this is just all around a crappy situation. Mick's soundtrack is incredible, and it's a large part of Doom's identity, and it sucks that all of this ultimately led to an official breakup and that we won't see Mick return. That's not to say there aren't other talented artists out there who can put their own spin into the Doom soundtrack, but Mick had this sort of unique and iconic flavor that a lot of fans of the modern day Doom are huge proponents of. But what happened, and I understand that id ultimately has to move on amidst the breakdown of this relationship, amidst Mick sort of mischaracterizing what happened, amidst sort of this contention between the two entities and the misunderstanding and the production issues and the soundtrack release that ultimately garnered some backlash due to the inconsistent quality. I do think that Marty Stratton dealt with this gracefully. He didn't go out of his way to bash Mick and his work. He actually expressed how much he respects his work and complimented him and kept wishing him the best, while also relaying his truth, his side of the story. And so I think this statement was handled pretty well, and I think id merits more credit in this situation than people originally gave them, given the accommodations and the flexibility that they gave Mick. Now, we'll see if Mick comes out with his own statement to refute any of this, but for now, this is the information that's out there. So with that, I would like to end this news update. Thank you for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on id's open letter in regards to this situation. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.